Today's story starts like a routine motorway scare, then refuses to behave like reality. It's December 11th, 2002 on the A3 near Guildford, Surrey, and drivers are dialing emergency lines because a car with blinding headlights is tearing through traffic like it has nothing to lose. Some swear they watch it leave the road, plunge down the embankment, and vanish into the trees. Police respond fast and find nothing. No wreck, no skid marks, no injured driver, just empty road and dense forest. But when they finally spot what's hidden beyond the verge, the timeline breaks in their hands, because whatever they found doesn't belong to tonight. So what did everyone see out there? And why does the road seem to repeat it? At around 7:20 p.m., on a cold Wednesday in December, the first call didn't sound supernatural. It sounded like the kind of call every control room learns to brace for. Half breath, half anger, words tripping over each other as if the caller is still gripping a steering wheel. A driver on the A3 said there was a car flying, that the headlights were painfully bright, that it was weaving and cutting and bullying its way through the traffic like it had no stake in staying alive. Another driver said the same thing, except he sounded older, calmer, almost embarrassed by how shaken he was. It's going to kill someone. It's going to. And then the line filled with the hollow roar of a motorway, and the man came back on, louder, insisting it had already happened. He'd just watched the thing leave the road. Within minutes, the phones began to stack. Not one hysterical report, not two. A cluster, different accents, different cars, different distances from one another, different angles of view, but the same thread. A vehicle moving too fast for the traffic, too fast for the dark, too fast for a road that never fully forgives a mistake. Some callers described the same detail in the same blunt phrase as if their eyes had latched onto it and refused to let go. The headlights. Not normal beams, not bright. Something closer to white hot. A glare that flattened depth and made the world look temporarily unreal. And then the last thing, the detail that turned the calls from nuisance into urgency. The car had gone down the embankment. It hadn't drifted. It hadn't nudged the verge. It had left. A sudden, decisive departure from the lane. A violent angle. A flash of white light dropping away into the black. A couple of callers said they saw a shuddering tumble at the tree line, like the undergrowth itself had swallowed metal. That was enough. A rural county control room doesn't have the luxury of debating whether a half-dozen motorists have collectively misread the same moment. The job isn't to doubt. It's to send help, to clear the scene, to keep the living from piling into the dead. So 2 officers were dispatched to the stretch being named again and again. The A3 near Burpham, on the approach by Guildford where the road runs hard and straight until it doesn't, where forest presses close enough that the edge of the world feels like a wall. They drove with their radio turned up, listening to new calls arrive in real time, each one feeding the same picture into their minds. The air outside their windscreen had the stale darkness of December, early night, damp cold, the sort of weather that makes reflective paint look sharper and puddles look deeper. They were expecting to see it almost immediately. Wreckage, hazard lights, a driver standing in the road with hands on their head, the chaotic choreography of a fresh collision. They saw nothing. No stopped traffic, no debris field, no smear of earth where a car had plowed down a slope. No cluster of taillights pinched together by gawping motorists. Just the usual flow, fast, impatient, sealed inside glass. The A3 didn't look injured. It looked normal, which can be the strangest sight of all when you've been sent to meet a disaster. They passed the area once, then looped back, They slowed. They scanned. Still nothing. If it had been a single call, they would have written it off as a misunderstanding, a frightened exaggeration, maybe even a prank. But the volume of reports did a quiet, persuasive thing. It made the absence feel wrong. Too many people had seen something for there to be nothing, so they kept searching. Not because they believed in ghosts, not because they wanted a story, but because the road was bordered on both sides by dense woodland, and every officer who has ever worked traffic knows the trick a car can play when it leaves asphalt at speed. It doesn't always stop where you can see it. Sometimes it burrows, sometimes it vanishes into bramble and shadow, tucked behind a rise, hidden by a ditch, swallowed by trees. Sometimes you can drive past a wreck a dozen times and never notice until the smell changes. They parked and stepped out. The motorway hissed past, a constant predatory sound. The verge was cold and uneven beneath their boots. Beyond the hard shoulder, the ground sloped away toward the trees, and the tree line had that winter density. Branches stripped, but still tangled. Undergrowth thick where nettles and bramble keep their grip even after the leaves have gone. They walk the edge, eyes trained into the dark, looking for a shape that didn't belong, looking for a glint, looking for the unnatural geometry of a machine interrupted by nature. At first, the forest offered nothing but itself. Then one of them caught a hint of something deeper in, a dull, artificial sheen, as if moonlight had found plastic or metal, and decided to hold it for a second. They pushed into the tree line. Off-road searches always change the world. On the carriageway, you are inside speed, noise, wind, the discipline of lanes. In the woods, everything shrinks. The air goes still. The sounds become close and specific. Boots on damp leaf litter, twigs snapping, their own breathing. Their torches carved narrow tunnels of visibility through trunks and brush. The closer they got, the clearer it became that the glint was not a beer can or a scrap of litter. It was a vehicle, what remained of one, angled wrong, set into the earth like the forest had grown around it in a single, violent day and then frozen. They called for backup as they moved, voices low, professional, because there is a ritual to approaching a crash. You don't know if you'll find someone alive. You don't know if you'll find someone trapped. You don't know if you'll find something that doesn't want to be found. The car sat nose down in a ditch buried in twisted undergrowth. From the road, it would have been invisible, just a suggestion of darkness behind darker trees. Up close, it felt old. Not old model, not classic. Old the way abandoned things get old, weather-bitten, dulled, stained by time. The bodywork had the look of having been there long enough for the forest to start reclaiming it. They approached the driver's side first, because you always approach the driver's side, because that's where you might see hands, eyes, movement. The driver's seat was empty. The interior was shadowy, awkwardly intact in some places and violently broken in others. Glass sparkled on fabric. The steering wheel sat at an angle that made the officers' stomachs tighten, a silent suggestion of force. They swept their torches through the cabin. No driver. Then the beam found the passenger side, and the scene shifted again. The front passenger door was open, yawning into the brush as if someone had crawled out in a hurry. And on the ground beyond that open door, just far enough away that your mind could try, briefly, to interpret it as something else, there was a human form. Not sitting, not standing, lying as if the last instruction the body had received was simply stop. The two officers circled the vehicle, stepping carefully, shoes sliding in wet leaves. They reached the far side and stopped, because whatever they were seeing didn't fit with the calls they'd been responding to. It didn't fit the expectation of a fresh crash, with a living person yelling for help or a dead person, still arranged in the brutal immediacy of impact. This looked like a scene that had been waiting. One of the officers swallowed and tried to make his voice steady as he updated control, because the radio is an anchor when your senses start to drift. He gave the location. He said they had a vehicle off-road. He said they had a casualty. But he did not say what, exactly, had made both of them stare down in the same quiet disbelief. Because to understand why two trained officers could stand in a forest beside a motorway and feel as if time itself had been tampered with, you have to go back 5 months, to the middle of summer, to a very different kind of night. On July 16th, 2002, the air in West London had the lazy warmth of a season that still believes it will last. Inside a pub, one of those ordinary places where the carpet smells faintly of spilled beer and the overhead lights are just dim enough to flatter everyone, Christopher Brian Chandler finished his drink. He was 21, young enough that the idea of a whole future still felt like something you could bargain with. He was out with a close friend, the kind of night that was supposed to be simple. A couple of pints, talk that goes nowhere, the comforting anonymity of being one face among many. But Christopher wasn't anonymous, not to himself. That was the problem. He had a reason to keep moving, a reason that lived under his skin like static. He was reportedly wanted by the Metropolitan Police in connection with a robbery, and whether he was guilty or simply tangled in something he couldn't outrun, the effect was the same. He couldn't relax. That kind of pressure doesn't always look like fear. Sometimes it looks like impatience. Sometimes it looks like irritability. Sometimes it looks like a man checking the door too often, flinching at laughter that's too loud, scanning faces that aren't paying attention to him. His friend noticed, asked casually if he was all right. Christopher made it sound normal, said he just didn't want to stay out too late, said he had to go. The lie was ordinary. The emotion underneath it wasn't. He stood, tossed money down, and said goodnight. Outside, the summer night wrapped him in warm air and distant traffic noise. The streetlights painted the pavements in patches. His car waited where he'd left it. Just another vehicle among thousands in a city that never truly sleeps. He got in and drove off. And then he disappeared. Not the dramatic kind of disappearance you get in films where someone is chased down an alley or dragged into a van. The quieter, more brutal kind. He simply stopped arriving. A brother waited for a message that didn't come. A friend checked their phone. Days passed, then weeks, and the absence took on weight. Eventually, Christopher's brother reported him missing. But even that report carried a peculiar hesitation. Because when someone is wanted by police, vanishing can look like strategy. It can look like choice. And from the perspective of officers in London who had a file with his name on it, a missing man who might be avoiding arrest doesn't automatically trigger the same urgency as a missing child or a vulnerable adult. So the world, in a way, shrugged. Christopher had left a pub. Christopher had driven into the night. Christopher had not been seen again. And the city kept breathing. Back in Surrey on December 11th, the motorway kept roaring beyond the trees as backup began to converge. The two officers stayed with the scene. Because that's what you do. You control what you can control. You keep people out. You preserve what you can preserve. You talk into the radio. You try not to let your imagination run ahead of your training. But the forest had its own language, and the car spoke it fluently. The undergrowth had wrapped itself around the bodywork in a way that didn't happen overnight. Dirt had settled. Moisture had worked its slow chemistry. The vehicle didn't look like something that had arrived in the last hour. It looked like something that had been tolerated by the woods for a long time. When specialists arrived, when the scene became more formal, more crowded, more procedural, the first practical question surfaced. Whose car? Whose body? And why now? The registration, once located, led to a name that did not belong to Surrey. It pointed back toward London, toward the missing person report that had been filed, and then, in the way of overburdened systems, allowed to fade into the background. Christopher Brian Chandler. The identification, according to multiple retellings, was later supported by dental records, a cold, clinical detail that says a lot without showing anything. And then the detail that explained the officer's earlier shock finally settled into words that could be put on paper. This was not a man who had died that evening. The remains indicated he had likely been there since July, for months, consistent with the police spokesman belief that the car left the road during that time, which meant the reckless driver so many motorists had reported at 7:20 p.m. on December 11th could not have been Christopher, at least not in the ordinary sense of time. And that is where the story hardens into its enduring shape, the shape that turns an incident into folklore, turns paperwork into whispers. Because those motorists were not describing a vague shadow. They weren't calling to say they felt uneasy. They described a car with blazing headlights, veering off the A3 at speed, plunging down the verge near Burpham, right where the Vauxhall was found, right where the ditch waited, right where the woods had been hiding the evidence in a plain sight. The official explanation has always had the clean austerity of procedure. Coincidence, misinterpretation, a different vehicle that didn't crash, a moment of collective error. The police spokesman's quote, "We believe the car left the road in July, discovered due to reports of headlights," doesn't claim the supernatural. It simply acknowledges the improbable chain of events. But folklore doesn't grow from what is probable. It grows from what is felt. Imagine the drivers that night, men and women who did not know each other, sealed in their own cars, moving through the same strip of darkness. Each of them sees something that yanks their attention from the hypnotic blur of headlights and reflective signs. Each of them feels that lurch in the stomach that comes when a stranger's mistake is about to become your tragedy. And then, hours later, perhaps days later, they hear, through local news, through a friend who knows someone who works with someone, that police searched the spot and found a car and a body. And the body had been there for months. The story doesn't require anyone to believe in ghosts. It only requires them to believe what they saw and to accept that the timeline doesn't want to cooperate. A crash reported as happening now, leading to the discovery of a crash that happened then. A set of calls that, in ordinary terms, should have led to wreckage on a December night, instead guiding officers to wreckage buried since July. That's the loop people talk about, not a science fiction circle you can step into, but a disturbing suggestion that a moment of violence can echo hard enough to be witnessed twice, once when it happened, and once when it needed to be found. In the end, there was a tangible resolution. A missing man was no longer missing. A family, however devastated, had an answer with a date attached to it. A vehicle that had been swallowed by trees was dragged back into the world and given its proper place in records. But one residue remained, and it is the reason the A3 near Burpham still gets spoken about with that careful tone people use when they don't want to sound foolish. If Christopher's car had been lying in a ditch 20 meters from the road, invisible behind undergrowth, while thousands of motorists passed day after day, then what exactly did so many people see on December 11th, 2002 at 7:20 p.m.? And why did it look so much like a crash that had already happened? This was Midnight Horror Society, dark curiosity for sleep. Until your next midnight session, sleep well.